things become so desperate. But on the other hand, things are so desperate both in Venezuela and Zimbabwe, and one hasn't had reform. And that's because, elections are stolen.
South Africa's economy is caught in a vicious cycle. So argues Jonathan Katzenellenbogen in a recent article on the Daily Friend online newspaper. He joins us today. So Jonathan, how did South Africa get caught in this vicious cycle?
Well, let me just describe what a vicious cycle is. A vicious cycle is a positive feedback system, as it's called, in which each iteration of the cycle reinforces another. And each aspect, each element in the cycle reinforces another. So what one has is low growth, and that reinforces higher unemployment and also, of course, lower tax take for the Treasury, and therefore higher deficits and the need for greater borrowing, and therefore higher interest rates, which in turn feed back into higher growth. So the opposite of a vicious cycle is a virtuous cycle, or circle, as it's sometimes called, in which each element in that and each iteration reinforces everything in a positive way. So higher growth would reinforce a higher tax take, which in turn would lower the budget deficit, which would lower the need for borrowing, and which you could conceivably have higher government spending to meet poverty needs and so forth. And also in this, of course, is bad governance. Bad governance means lower productivity. Lower productivity means lower growth. So it's all interconnected as economic factors are.
Enjoying this analysis? Click here to sign up for our 30-day free trial for more content from the CIA.
So Jonathan, what symptoms are we seeing of this vicious cycle across various areas of South Africa's economy?
Importantly, what's being seen, and for some time, is a declining rate of per capita income. And that's really what counts. So for the last 5 years or so, one has had a drop-off in the level of real per capita income. That's inflation adjusted. And one's also had, and that's fundamentally because our growth rate has been declining annually since for about 10 years, since about 2007, 2008. So one's seen that, and one's seen higher unemployment. And even with the rebound after the terrible year of 2020, when there was very tight lockdowns, one has not seen an increase in employment. One has seen an increase in unemployment to record high levels in the third quarter of last year. And that has to be very worrying, because even with growth, one is not getting higher employment. And that feeds into everything else. And that could, in turn, further worsen the cycle, because it's going to create these political demands for a basic income grant, which would lead to higher deficit, need for higher borrowing, and potentially, of course, push the country towards a crisis where where the markets don't want to invest in our bonds, or don't want to invest in our bonds to the same extent. And we're very reliant on that.
And of course, as you point out in your article, energy and infrastructure are also severe bottlenecks to South Africa's growth.
If one had the basics, one in this country, one overpays for basic services, electricity and transport. And of course, the power production is in crisis here and has been for some time. There's no real plan to deal with this problem. So without electricity, we can't have the sort of growth rates that we require. The Eskom is poorly managed and has been for many years, and has to be. I believe it's going to run at a profit this year, but that's an exception, and it relies heavily on subsidies, and has done for many years. And Transnet, the transportation state-owned enterprise, is a disaster as well. And combined with this, one has had the theft of its rail lines throughout the country. And these are basic services in which one relies on to keep the economy ticking over, and for, of course, economic growth.
And Jonathan, many of the causes of these problems lie ultimately with poor policies. And as you point out in the article, the government instead of embracing reform, is doubling down on some of these harmful policies. Why do you think that the government is doing that, and how is that amplifying some of these problems?
I think it's partially ideology. They can't admit failure. You know, I think they're in a universe of their own, and they can't. They're not going to do a mass privatization of Eskom or Transnet immediately. I don't see that happening. And by the time they do privatize it, it might be so broken that they'll have to sell off these sorts of assets for nothing, as happened in Eastern Europe, and hope for a turnaround. I don't really know. You know, I think it's strongly ideological. And of course, it's a commitment to their political allies, COSATU, the Communist Party, and also the need to maintain large state payrolls to support many people. And without that, you know, their support would drop throughout the country among the people who are let go, as well as their relatives who rely on them. So they are the ANC is in a politically precarious situation. If we had fast growth, you know, we could do these sorts of things, as potentially people could find jobs, but that's not the case. It's a slowing economy. So, you know, to change all this and to make the vicious cycle into a virtuous one needs something to happen externally to the circle, and that is reform. And, you know, one's got to discuss the potential for that. Ultimately, it has to happen. That's what my belief is. It has to happen.
And as we've long argued at the CRA, reform appetite is pretty low within the government. So there might be some kind of exogenous factor that might force the government's hand, or in fact, the change of government.
Well, I think, you know, what happens ultimately is things might get so bad, as in, for instance, they did in Zambia, that people voted for the candidate, the presidential candidate, that had a reform agenda. So, you know, things become so desperate. But on the other hand, you know, things are so desperate both in Venezuela and Zimbabwe, and one hasn't had reform. And that's because, you know, elections are stolen. But one just hopes and prays that that would not happen in this country. And so one would have reform.
Jonathan Katzenellenbogen, thank you very much for joining us on the CRA channel. Let's hand over to you, our viewers. Why is South Africa caught in this vicious economic cycle, and how can it reverse this trend? Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. My name is David Ansara. This is the CRA. Until next time, take care.